Hello everybody and welcome back to the Crash F1 YouTube channel. F1 testing is well underway in 2025 and we're going to get straight in to everything we've learned so far. Lewis, what have you made of testing?
Yeah, finally all the sort of talk pre-season's over and we're finally getting to see some cars on track, and that's obviously a massively exciting moment of the season, finally getting the opportunity to see all the cars out collectively in a test and get some really important unrestricted mileage for the teams. This is the only opportunity they get before the season actually starts for real, to run their cars in sort of anger and learn everything about them and check that everything's working as they expect. We've seen them all complete some sort of mini filming days and shakedowns and stuff like that, but they're restricted in terms of mileage. So this is really the first proper chance to see collectively everybody running their cars together and start to sort of form an impression of how everybody's looking and what's going on. And naturally, with 3 days of 8 hours of, well, I was going to say undisrupted running, but that wasn't the case on the first day.
Of course,
we obviously had this circuit-wide power cut, which meant that nothing was happening for about an hour, and then we finally had the session extended later in the day. But yeah, it's the first chance to really sort of dial down into setups and for the teams to run their cars and learn about them, because the next time we'll see them is for real in practice in Melbourne, and we'll be going straight into a Grand Prix weekend, and that's when we'll really know for sure where everyone lies in the competitive order.
And I suppose what is so important, particularly with this regulation cycle, is that there are only going to be very tiny marginal gains. There's kind of been split messaging from what I've seen from the teams, where they're all kind of saying that the cars are totally new, Ferrari saying they've upgraded 99% of it, but then they're also saying it's a continuation, and you have the kind of macro context of the new regulation cycle next year. One of the most important things, we spent most of the first 3 episodes of the podcast talking about it, seeing Lewis Hamilton driving that 2025 Ferrari, as you said, in anger, basically, for the first time, the car that he'll arrive at Albert Park with. Connor, there were some interesting comments made by Helmut Marko after the first day yesterday. I know you wrote an article on that. I'm interested to know basically what he said and kind of where you think those comments were coming from.
Yeah, so Marco just gave his initial reaction to, let's say, the top 4 teams. He said he was most impressed with McLaren and Mercedes. Their long runs were quite impressive. It seems like Red Bull are back on track. Max was happy with the handling of the RB21, so Max can do what he wants to do with it. So it's early days, but the signs are positive there. But the most interesting part of what he said was he was a bit disappointed by Ferrari. He expected more from Ferrari, and we felt on the onboards, Hamilton did run wide a few times. The ride over the bumps looked a little bit tricky compared to last year as well. Of course, it's only day 1, so it is early days, and Marco's going to have more data, more information than we have, so we've got to take his comments a bit more seriously, but it is only day 1, and there can be setup changes. We know how difficult these cars are to set up, so if Ferrari have changed so much of their car, it might take a little bit more time to refine the setup and see how to get it perfectly working. So it is early days, but no, it was interesting to see that Ferrari appear to be on the back foot, according to Red Bull.
We do sort of need to take what teams are saying relatively, for face value, because they do have the data and they can see all these kind of things. But yeah, the Ferrari certainly looked a little bit better today. Hamilton was a little bit like struggling with sort of mid-corner balance and rear stepping out a few times on Wednesday morning when he made his debut. But the same was true for a few teams. It was also very windy at the track yesterday as well, so I think that has to be taken into account. But then this is also part and parcel of testing. It's the first time they've really run the cars and are learning how to best set up the cars, and that comes with it. So yeah, it perhaps was a little bit premature for him to make those comments, but ultimately we will have to wait and see as the day goes on. But certainly this morning things looked a little bit better. The car looked a little bit easier to drive and a bit more stable. And obviously Hamilton was able to start extracting some lap time from it. We don't know how hard he was pushing and all that kind of side to it, but the time was there and it didn't look like he was, on the ragged edge or anything like that. It looked like it was a fairly sort of safe lap. So yeah, it's hard to tell, but certainly McLaren looked quite strong yesterday. Their car looked particularly planted, and Norris and Piastri were able to sort of attack the corners without too much trouble. The Red Bull looked pretty good as well, but also we saw Liam Lawson having a bit of a spin and Max Verstappen having a few wide moments. But generally, the noises we've heard coming out from Red Bull have been very positive. And Marco also said, in addition to his comments about Ferrari, that they are pretty confident now that they've actually fixed already the issues that they sort of dogged them last season, with all the balance and handling problems that we saw towards sort of the middle part of last season that sort of threatened to derail the campaign. Obviously, Verstappen ended up winning the title fairly comfortably in the end, but it certainly sort of threw them off course a bit last season, and they seem pretty confident that the RB21 has sort of ironed out those issues, which is, I think, probably the biggest takeaway to sort of take away from the sort of opening days of running we've seen so far, that Red Bull seem to be pretty confident. But as you mentioned, yeah, the cars are, the word that's being branded around is evolutionary rather than a revolution, as we'd expect at the end of a rules, sort of the end of a regulation set. And we've obviously got the big rule change coming in for next season. And that's been a real point for teams to consider, is how they split their development on this year's car to make sure they get the most out of this season, whilst also really focusing on the next rule set, which is obviously in place for the next 4 years. And that's where the biggest gains can be found, and potentially teams who are currently sort of in the midfield or towards the back can really make a step forward if they get things right. So there's that balance to be struck of, it's easier for the teams, say the Saubers and the Williams, who are towards the back, and you're talking about 1 or 2 championship positions. They might be scrapping over towards the back, 8th, 9th, 10th in the championship. They can really look at next season and be like, right, we're going to put everything into next season because we can make bigger gains there, and we could potentially move up and break into the top 6, top 5, that kind of thing. Whereas for the teams at the front, the likes of Red Bull, the likes of Ferrari, McLaren, they also have to have an eye on this season, because obviously they're in championship contention. And we've sort of seen that with Ferrari changing 99% of their car over the winter. Even though it's still being described as an evolution, they've actually made some quite significant changes to their car. And that's something that Christian Horner alluded to as well. He was made an interesting point that he thought that the Ferrari is sort of the standout of the field this year, whereas most of the cars sort of look the same and haven't really changed too much, visibly at least, from what we can see. He sort of feels that the Ferrari is the standout there, that looks a little bit different, that is maybe a bit of an outlier. So it's interesting how much focus Ferrari have put. They're clearly focused on winning a championship this season, at least one championship, having come so close last season to ending that title drought. They clearly for sure. Still focused on 25.
Sorry, it's interesting you say that, right, about how the teams are kind of weighting 25 and 26 as kind of two different years. I'm reminded, I think I was watching yesterday, James Vowles was talking very much about that plan is for 2026. And then you have other teams, as you mentioned, like Ferrari, who, with the signing of Lewis, he wouldn't have signed that deal if he thought that they were going to wait until 2026 to have a good car. He would have just gone in 2026, right? If they had to convince him to sign for 25, they must have shown him this very aggressive, confident design style. And it's exactly right. Like you mentioned the comments that Horner made. I think with some kind of confidence within Red Bull and accuracy, they can say that most of the field are converging on basically Adrian's Red Bull concept design. They're looking more and more like the Red Bull as they kind of progress to what is effectively the solution to this regulation, right? The kind of single correct answer. The Ferrari is the detachment from that. If they're right, they look like geniuses. They look like they've figured out their own solution and they've come away from that. You spoke about McLaren too, winning the Constructors' title last year, winning in Abu Dhabi last year. They seem like the kind of obvious favourite candidates. And in terms of what has come out in the messaging, they've done all the running they want to do. The reliability across the field has been brilliant this year, but particularly within there, they haven't kind of struggled in the same way. Although we did see Piastri hit Hulkenberg earlier, right? But that's just a kind of small moment. That was that funny moment. I wondered if you could, I think, someone who's been at a testing before Lewis, I wanted to ask what your thoughts were on the moment of the photographers trying to jump over the wall of McLaren's, line of centre-backs around the car. Was that kind of a serious moment? What's the atmosphere like within testing? Because people are bringing new bits, people are bringing new parts that they want to keep secret. And we know that all the teams have photographers who are all pointing cameras at each other in a kind of prisoner's dilemma. How did you kind of think of that moment? Was it just a nice clip for the socials?
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of seriousness about it as well. Like, obviously, this is important run times for the teams to gather data on their cars. And yeah, it was quite a sort of attention-grabbing moment towards the end of day one. Literally the last run that Lando conducted, we saw him underneath some bubble wrap in the cockpit of the car while the team were spraying the car with this neon green Flovis paint, which they used to check the airflow over the car and make sure that everything's working as expected and sort of correlates to everything they've seen on the wind tunnel. Because obviously this is the first time we're seeing the cars in a real world on track. So they need to make sure that everything's correlating as expected. So these kind of runs are common sights in Formula 1 preseason testing. We see the cars with big aero rakes and Flovis paint often all over them, but it was the amount of Flovis that was over the McLaren. It almost looked like the Sauber with the amount of green that was sprayed over it. And then we saw Lando go out and just do a single run. He could, barely even see out one of his wing mirrors. There was so much paint all over it. And he came back in, and then we got this kind of amusing pictures of there was at least 10, 15 mechanics waiting in the garage for him to pull in, and when he came in, they were all crowded around the car to make sure that nobody could get those sort of snapshots. The photographers and the cameramen couldn't get those sort of high quality images, close-ups of the intricate parts of the car. It was sort of a bit of a light-hearted moment when we saw there was a photographer trying to get some photos, and a few of the McLaren crew were sort of jumping up and waving their hands in front of the camera to block any snaps there, and they were all sort of laughing and joking. So it was, it was a element of fun to it, but they also do want to try and conceal as much as possible, because having that much of their cars sort of out on show for other teams specifically will get high quality images of the car and be able to learn exactly how the airflow is working and get a better picture of what McLaren are doing, which obviously ended last season as the class of the field, and as you say, sort of the favourites going into this year. So yeah, it was really interesting to see the amount of what they were potentially willing to give away to their rivals, because obviously the preseason testing is now televised, and we see the footage. We have high quality cameras around the track that are following the car. So as much as they tried to hide it when he was back in the garage, they were still visible to the entire world and all the other teams during his run, and we got some quite clear shots of the McLaren there. So gone are the days.
They'll be on screen now if you want to.
Yeah, gone are the days of preseason testing where there was so much secrecy around it, and you get some sort of grainy CCTV footage or photographers who have got some spy shots. That kind of thing is gone now, and everything's exposed and in the open. So it's much harder for teams to sort of hide that. Yeah, McLaren certainly there seems to be a bit of confidence around the team. There was a little bit of sort of delayed to the afternoon running yesterday, and a little bit of talk around sort of Norris wasn't on track for that long. He took a while to come out after the lunch break, and then he spent a bit of time in the garage. And I think again on day two we've seen the McLaren not out on track a huge amount, but the team say, certainly on day one anyway, that that was all part of the planned program and set up changes and all these kind of things. So there seems to be quite a sort of a quiet confidence around McLaren at this stage, and so it's sort of giving off the impression that they are a team that just are quite confident and know everything is coming back as expected so far. There's no dramas, no concerns necessarily, and they look to be in a good position. And ultimately they want to follow up that first Constructors' Championship in 20 odd years. They want to follow that up and not only defend it and win it back, but also challenge for the Drivers' Championship this year too, and try and make it a World Championship double.
And speaking of quiet confidence, I do want to throw to Connor, because I'm aware that you've been watching me and Lewis yap along here. I'm reminded, one of the first testing sessions that I sort of watched the majority of was in 2023, and what came out of that was basically people correctly saying ignore the timings, but in terms of body language and in terms of just watching the car, the Aston Martin was a clear step forward, right? People could tell that Aston Martin kind of came in with this confidence, and we know how quickly they started 2023. Still, 3 days away from Adrian joining that team. But they seem again this year to be walking with a certain confidence, if we take a step back from the top 4 candidates who will remain the top 4 we know for a long time, where else do you see the storylines kind of below them on the grid so far?
Yeah, I think Aston have proved over the last 2 years they can start seasons well, but the problem is they're in-season development. So I think at the start of the season, it'd be surprising not to see Aston maybe as the 5th best team. But I think during testing, I think Alpine have gone under the radar. I think they've looked pretty strong on track. I think Williams as well had a really solid test compared to last year. I think last year maybe everyone thought they were the 9th, 10th fastest team. They didn't do much running. It was all doom and gloom. But this year, I think with Carlos there's better vibes. James Vowles has been talking very positively. Obviously, they are looking to 2026 as well. But I think with Sainz's input and his professionalism, and he's a race winner, he had his best season in F1 last season. I think the vibes are good there as well. So I think the battle for the 5th fastest team is going to be quite interesting. I think the top 4 aren't going to be too far ahead. And I think you've got to mention Haas as well. I think they were probably with the 6th fastest team last year. And they're doing what they did in last year's test. They was focusing on heavy fuel running, long runs, looking after the tyres. That's all they're focusing on. So there's no attention, there's no pressure on them at the minute. They're at the bottom of the timesheets and they're going under the radar as well. So it's hard to call. I think there's probably a 10th or 2 between 5th to 8th or 9th. So I think it's going to be a really hard one to call. But yeah, Aston, Alpine, Williams, I think it's going to be a good midfield battle once again.
I don't think there's been a real sort of clear sort of loser from testing so far. I don't think anybody's really jumped out as sort of being in a bad spot or having a particularly bad test so far. I think that just sort of underlines how not only how sort of reliable the cars are these days and how everything runs, but also that we're getting towards the end of this rule set. And I think most teams are starting to, if they haven't already, sort of understand their packages a bit more. And yeah, sort of Connor mentioned, I think pretty much every team has had a pretty solid test so far. There's been no big major problems for any team. Every team has managed to rack up laps, and on the whole, all of the cars have looked fairly stable out on track, and nobody seems to have any big dramas or problems. And I think generally across the board, most teams seem to be pretty happy with where they're at.
It should be a really exciting year, and you're absolutely right to mention. I think when we look across the whole grid, the strength of the grid is just super, super high this year. You look at a team like Sauber, who you say are expected to be at the back, but they've got the reigning Formula 2 champion, and Nico Hülkenberg, who's one of the most respected midfield drivers in the sport and has been massively experienced and will know basically what to tell their design team. He knows what a fast car needs, fast car should feel like, and has been in the sport throughout all these technical generations, and which continues to be into it next year. I know that kind of one of the main things from listening to the commentary is basically people trying to align the numbers that they get in their simulator, the numbers that they're getting in their 60% scale wind tunnel, and the numbers that they're getting from testing, and basically nailing that correlation is what enabled McLaren to have this incredible kind of in-season development last year. Kind of one of the teams that I think we could maybe round out by touching on is Mercedes, who have been in this struggle to understand their development and basically understand why they even at times didn't know why they were faster. We spoke about that on the last show, particularly with a new young driver coming in who's got a lot of hype around him. I think Antonelli's looked really kind of solid, dependable. We know he's done a lot of testing of previous cars, so testing at Bahrain won't be something new to him. But Connor, how do you think it's gone for Mercedes so far? Do you think that they're on the kind of right path to unlocking, James Allison and the technical team over there, unlocking the secrets of a car that does seem in the right window, a race-winning car?
I mean, so far, so good, I think, for Mercedes. I think the caveat is that Bahrain, the conditions were a lot colder than usual. Usually it's like 30, 40 degrees, like 17, 15 degrees, a little bit of rain. And we saw last year, the Mercedes always performed well when it was cooler and tracks where there was long straights as well. So I think if you were doing probably a bit of a pecking order, but you have McLaren at the top, I think Mercedes are right up there as well. So I think taking that into account, it's been a great test. But the caveat is, when it is hotter, when we go to Australia or these other places, can the car actually perform? But if you just look at the onboards, it looks actually a pretty good car. So I think all the signs are good, but I think with Mercedes, you can't trust them anymore. I think the last three years have shown that the inconsistencies are there. They don't 100% understand the regulations either. So I think time will tell. But if you just look at testing, it looks great. But let's wait and see.
I think they've been sort of downplaying stuff, haven't they, over this winter going into the next season. I think Toto Wolff's been quite keen to sort of downplay their prospects and not talk too much before the season gets underway. And I think that's interesting after, as Connor touched on, the last few years, we've obviously heard a lot of confidence that they finally unlocked the car, they know what they're doing, and then it comes down to it and there's still have those performance fluctuations and inconsistencies throughout the season. But yeah, I agree. I think so far so good, and it seems positive. The car looks better. I think it is important to mention that caveat of the conditions and obviously the track, and it is cooler in Bahrain. And yeah, Mercedes dominated last season in Vegas when the track conditions were particularly cool. So it's hard to read too much into it, but certainly seems positive, and the noises coming out of the team are also quite positive as well. George Russell's been saying that he's pretty confident that they've made a significant step with the design of the car, but also that they won't fall into those sort of traps and pitfalls that they have in previous years, where they've gone down one development route and then discovered a plethora of issues along the way that have opened up to other problems and hampered them throughout the season. So yeah, I think there's probably a quiet optimism at Mercedes that they might have finally sort of figured out what they're doing and can hope to have a bit more of a consistent season ahead.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I think it's been a pretty busy few days so far, I know, for you boys on the site. So I would recommend, if you want best testing coverage in the game, check out Crash.net. Lewis's work on there and Connor have been all the headlines, all the quotes that are coming out from all the pundits and ourselves. So keep in touch with that if you want to stay up to date with live updates and reports of everything that is going on with testing. I will say thank you very much for watching our coverage of it so far, and we'll be back with a podcast next week to wrap it all up. Thank you for joining me today, guys.